afternoon to in-house counsel and in-house legal professionals from all across North America and the world, right? With Singapore in the house. We are worldwide officially. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect. I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast time or your lunch time with us. And special thanks and dinner time. I don't know what time it is in Singapore, to be honest, but thank you to our friend from Singapore. And thank you to our wonderful sponsor today, LinkSquares, and our fantastic panel featuring Jonathan Greenblatt, Ashlyn Donahue, Shawn Hoyt, and Jenn Post, who are going to teach us CLM for In-House Counsel, why CLM solutions fail, and how to succeed when implementing CLM solutions. We are joined today by Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the VP of Legal at LinkSquares, Ashlyn Donahue, who is the Director of Legal at LinkSquares, Jenn Post. She is the Director of Services at LinkSquares, and Shawn Hoyt, who is not at LinkSquares. He is the VP of Commercial at OutSystems. We have a fantastic moderator, Ashlyn Donahue. So Ashlyn, I'll turn things over to you to take it from here.
So today we're going to be talking about why CLM implementations fail and how you can succeed. No one buys a CLM or any technology for that matter with the intent of not being successful in their launch. But unfortunately, sometimes that does happen. And it doesn't go out as you planned, and you have to shift course. So my name is Ashlyn Donahue. I'm the Director of Legal here at LinkSquares. If you're not familiar with our company, we're an AI-powered end-to-end contract lifecycle management. And we're here today to talk about some of the common pitfalls that you might face when implementing a CLM and how to successfully navigate over them. We're going to walk through CLM and legal tech overview and what they are and what they mean, just so we can level set and be talking about the same terminology today. We're going to talk about some common pitfalls and how you can successfully overcome them and have a successful CLM implementation. And then last but not least, talk about some key considerations for success in your CLM rollout. And some Q&A. I will say we have some time reserved at the end for Q&A, but please do feel free to drop questions in throughout. We want to engage. We want this to be very interactive. So we look forward to watching in the chat and talking about those questions throughout the session today. All right, so speakers, Jonathan, do you want to kick us off with an intro? I'd love to hear a little bit about how you have worked with CLMs in the past and implementing them, as well as what your role is today.
My name is Jonathan. I'm the Vice President of Legal here at LinkSquares. And before joining LinkSquares, I helped build contract management processes with systems at 3 different companies starting back in 2009. Contract management has changed so much, and it's honestly just the technology has gotten so much better, and the understanding of it is so much more prevalent in organizations these days. But with that, there are still now new expectations and new challenges. And so at LinkSquares, we've been part of about 1,000 implementations just since the time that I've been here. And you start to see patterns, what makes an implementation successful and what sets teams up for frustration. So Ashlyn, look forward to discussing some of the key things that will drive successful implementations and some pitfalls and how to make sure your implementation is delivering real value to your org.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Shawn, do you want to kick us off with a quick introduction?
Yes, very happy to be here. I have been involved in 2 CLM so far, one at a prior company and one here at OutSystems. Both of those were on the sales side, looking possibly at a 3rd implementation on our procurement side. So it's something that's near and dear to my heart. One was in 2019, one was in 2023, and this most recent one is straddling 24 and 25. It is one of the core parts of my role. In my role, I run our commercial legal team at OutSystems, which means basically responsible for all of our contracts and contract operations across customers, suppliers, and partners. And for those of you who've never heard of OutSystems, we are a global software provider in the low-code, rapid application development space. So we have a platform that allows developers to build new applications with a ton of automation within very quick timeframes. And we have customers in about 80 countries.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Shawn. Jenn, last but not least, if you could give a quick introduction and we'll dive right in.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jenn. I'm the Director of Services at LinkSquares. I've been with the company for almost 4 years at this point. My background is actually in implementation itself. One thing that I say often, and I think is pretty commonplace in folks who hold the similar role to me, is that across the board, implementation is implementation. What I've learned a lot from working with this legal operations persona, and it's been super exciting to see, how we've been able to evolve with not only the way that the market is changing, right, but also in the way that we are getting better at understanding how we can better serve the problems that lawyers are facing every single day. So I'm super excited to chat with you all today and to talk about how maybe we can all do a little bit better when getting this thing set up.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen. So with that, we will dive right in. So we wanted to just set the stage on what legal technology is and what a CLM is. So just to start, legal technology at a high level is a category of software that supports legal stakeholders and use cases, whether that's contract management, e-billing. The type of software that fits in this category can vary, but what we're really focused on here today is contract lifecycle management, which is a subset of legal technology. Just wanted to give a quick stat on legal tech as overview as a category. So it's expected that legal tech market will reach $50 billion in value by 2027. It's with Gen AI as a key driver. That's massive. Just to think about the way that legal technology and CLM is impacting the legal use cases and stakeholders at companies is just incredible to see. CLM, just at a high level, is an end-to-end solution to manage both the pre-signature contract lifecycle management from creation of an agreement through negotiation and signature, as well as the post-signature repository, which may include features that allow you to track certain information about your contracts or generate some information using artificial intelligence or AI. It really is that streamlined, centralized location for legal users and their stakeholders to interact throughout the contract lifecycle management process. And so really, what are some of the benefits here? It can increase efficiency in your contracting, increasing deal velocity, which, as we all know, for those in the legal use case, moving deals faster to closure is just such a core part of what legal is tasked with doing at most companies. Can help with cost savings, really help you identify where you might have overlap, where you have opportunities to continue to increase cost and efficiency, and then improve compliance, whether that's through an M&A diligence, contract obligations you have to manage. Really having that centralized location to manage all of that information is helpful in enabling you to move forward with some greater compliance on that side. So, Jonathan, real quick, curious, when you've implemented CLMs in the past, are you typically looking to solve a pain point on the pre-signature side, post-signature side, or both? What has really been the driver for your teams?
Yeah, so I think part of this is very industry specific. My career has been in business to business SaaS companies. And for us, I think increasing efficiency was always the pain point that we were trying to solve the quickest. You wanted to make sure that everything was flowing through the legal team quickly and in an efficient manner, and things weren't getting lost, all the way from the starting the contract and picking the right template, all the way through signature and making sure it ends up in the right place. So that was always the pain point that I was solving for.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Shawn, what about you? What has typically been driving your decision to implement a CLM?
I often, when I talk to people about CLM, I often differentiate between the level of complexity and variation within a company's contracts, and then the level of volume. Like I said, I've done it twice, and they were polar opposites. In one case, it was low volume, but extremely high variability. These contracts were really bespoke, almost always on customer paper. And in that case, the repository became the most critical thing, so we could understand that variation. At OutSystems, there's less variation, but the volume is really high. So in that case, it became the pre-signature workflows that became so much more important, because how are we going to handle hundreds of contracts a quarter in a way that's scalable? So I think it depends on where you fall in that continuum of variation and customization on one hand, and then volume on the other.
I'm curious, Jen, any other things you would add based on what you've seen from customers that we didn't talk about here?
Honestly, I think that Shawn and Jonathan covered a lot of the ground of things to consider. One of the interesting things about implementing software is really understanding what problems that you're looking to solve, right? So leaning in a little bit more heavy into what Shawn was saying, thinking about what your most immediate or pressing business need is, and being able to explain that to your vendor and keeping that at the forefront of the problem solving that you're looking to implement.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So with that, let's just dig into common pitfalls. Like I said, no one kicks off a CLM implementation or any technological implementation with the intention of failing, but sometimes it happens for a variety of reasons. So what we want to do today is talk about some of those common pitfalls and what folks might run into and how they can overcome them so that they can get it right the first time. So really, pitfall number one, implementation and execution obstacles. So there are a variety of different ways that you can handle an implementation approach, whether that's a big bang rollout all at once, getting all of your contracts in the system, all of your templates and pre-signature side set up and ready to go. Or you can have a phased approach where maybe you're approaching it from a geographical perspective, a contract type perspective, or maybe a department perspective. Shawn, when your team was planning your CLM implementation, what key factors did you evaluate to help determine whether or not you wanted to go with a phased approach or a big bang approach? And how did you evaluate that? What did you select?
One of the key factors that we really thought hard about was what would be the impact on the business in the quarter, because we're in software, hitting your quarterly targets and the sales rhythm is extremely important. So what would be the impact on the business in the quarter if we failed, or if we hit hiccups, or if there were unexpected problems? And we realized that looking back to prior failures with in-out systems, not in the CLM side, but with other solutions that had been rolled out. For example, a year ago, before we launched the CLM, the company had launched a CPQ, configure price quote solution, and it did actually affect the quarter in terms of the ability for sellers and to get their deals done and processed. So we were very careful to say, let's not do that first. We opted for a phased approach where we implemented a few parts of the solution that wouldn't impact the ability of sellers to close their deals in the quarter. Made sure those were successful, and then we did the finalize pre-signature workflows last, once we had confidence that we had hit a good rhythm and there was no disruption to the business. In our case, the phased approach reduced risk of impacting the flow of the business.
That's great. And in that decision to go with a phased approach, you talked about really focusing in on making sure that you kept the business running, right? It was a quarter model and you wanted to make sure there was no hiccups or impacts to your business. What kind of trade-offs did you have to make for that? Were there things that you had to say, that's okay, we're going to get comfortable with not getting this rolled in right off the bat? And how did you discuss that with your stakeholders?
One of the trade-offs was just the timing. By waiting a little bit longer and doing some earlier phases, we obviously pushed out the date of that final phase, which was the biggest one. So that our final phase affected by far the most users. We had to say, are we okay just starting with the small user groups who are doing a lot of the back office processing, the heavy operations work, and leaving it to put it to the frontline sellers at the end? And part of the risk of that approach, because there was a risk, which is that put our launch date at October 1st, and we're a calendar company. So we were going to launch this the first day of the last quarter of the year. And some people were scared about that and wanted to launch it earlier so that we'd have time to course correct if problems came up. But we convinced them that by the time we got to October 1st, we would have worked the kinks out already before launch, and therefore we'd had confidence in that October 1 launch and we wouldn't impact negatively our final quarter. And that's the way it worked out.
And I do think sometimes starting with smaller groups, really building those champions can help with a longer term successful implementation of the solution as well. So I think that definitely resonates well with me. So Jonathan, you talked a little bit about efficiency being a key driver for some of your past CLM implementations. Curious, how did the need for efficiency impact the rollout strategy you selected, and what did you go with, big bang or phased approach?
Definitely phased approach. For us, similar to Shawn, sales was very important, and we needed to make sure that we had familiarity with the system. So we opted to work with our vendor contracts first, get a system there, understand the tool we were using, and then we rolled it out to the sales team after that. Before we even selected the tool we were going to use, we made sure to get sales' involvement and to get their buy-in and to understand what the tool was going to do. We just rolled it out a little bit slower.
That's great. Would you make the same decision today, holding and focusing on the vendor over the sales, or would you maybe think about it differently?
I think it really depends on the organization and the volume of what you're dealing with on each side. I've heard some customers will start very discreetly with an NDA, like one document type, and roll that in. Personally, I do think once you roll it out to a team, I want to roll it out to the entire team for that use case, for the sales use case. But I've heard of people being very successful in working on a much more discrete use case and then building on top of that.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. So Jen, just curious, I know you work with lots of customers every day with their implementation strategies. What commonalities do you see across the companies that succeed from a big bang or a phased approach? Is there anything that you think is a good takeaway that we could share with everyone listening today?
Yeah, this is, I think, going to sound a little bit obvious, but I think that one of the things that really matters here is making sure that you know what you're signing up for. I think that for our most successful implementations, there's been really strong alignment between the customer who's coming on board with us and the team that's actually working on the implementation process itself. Really having a strong understanding of what are your own internal flows, what are the things that you're looking to accomplish, and are you effectively communicating that not only to us as your vendor, but also internally and driving that buy-in across the rest of your organization, right? Ultimately, implementing a CLM is most significantly impacting the legal team, but it has broader ripple effects across the rest of the organization. So making sure that you're locking into that is something that's super important to make sure that you're off the bat making this a success. I would also say that really just doing what you can to make sure that across the organization that you're aligned on what your problems are. That way, when it comes to the implementation, you're able to prioritize those problems that need to be identified as the number one problem.
That's great. Thanks. I love that. If everything's a priority, it's hard to be successful. Great takeaways. I think one of the things that I learned over time in implementing tech over the years myself is striving for perfection with systems that have really complex and amazing capabilities sometimes meant that I kept pushing rollout further and further back, just trying to make it perfect and more perfect. And I don't think if I were to go back into my earlier days, I might have approached it a little differently now today and really focus on what my success is and get there and then move beyond it. But really, I think that's one thing we want to talk about is really striving for that perfection instead of figuring out what it is you need to go with live on day one and then iterating and improving as you learn and use the system. Jen, what key factors would you recommend someone consider when they have to figure out what is it that they need to get over the finish line to be able to roll out and go live with day one versus waiting for it to be perfect? Like how should they weigh those pros and cons and what that endpoint is for launch?
Understanding where you're falling in your budget cycle, where you're falling in your calendar cycle, right? Your fiscal cycle really is something that does matter. Depending on how large of an implementation this is going to be, also is something to consider. I think that Jonathan touched on it. Very rarely will we ever say, let's jump out of the gate and start with an order form, right? When we're setting up contract on the pre-signature side, right? What we really want to focus on are the building blocks. So how do we make sure that across your organization, we're working with you to drive that the decisions that we're making across the implementation impact all parts of the CLM, right? Is definitely a conversation that you're going to be having with your teams and is also going to be a consideration for how you're planning on getting your end users enabled and trained and what this is going to look like from a rollout perspective. One of the things that I talk about a lot is there's like the concept of how do you eat an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. So really understanding what those bite-sized chunks look like for your specific organization is critical to your success.
That's great. Thanks so much for that. Now, Shawn, I know you really leaned into a phased approach in your implementation, and I'd love to hear what advice you have for our listeners today for how to really approach making the decision around what it is you're going to go live with first. Did you build pros cons lists? Did you talk to stakeholders and get feedback? What tactical measures did you take to really decide what success at day one was going to look like for your organization?
For us, I think I had in my first CLM implementation, I had just launched the repository for post-signature analytics and tracking. And so I knew that well, and I knew it was a fairly quick process. It involved a fairly small number of heavy users. I figured that was a pretty reliable out of the gate success that we could achieve. So we went for our repository first. A lot of people are asking, what do you do about if you have a large volume of legacy contracts? Do you bring those all in at the same time? And like many of the people in the comments, we decided not to. We decided to only bring in the active contracts or expired contracts with active customers. All of the customers that had churned, for example, or all of the things that were beyond a certain number of years expired, we left them out and just kept them in a Google Drive. And so that made it a lot simpler. They probably eliminated 1,000 agreements from the repository. But the big thing for us is that in terms of the balance between perfection and iterating is It was okay if all the functionality wasn't there on day one or there were new bells and whistles we were going to release over time. But the key is that the data had to be credible. We had to do enough data validation that when people started working in the repository, they would say, okay, this data looks accurate. Because if you don't do that and people start working in the system and the information looks wrong, they're going to immediately discount it and perhaps not use it. I think you need to do enough data validation on the front end that when people look at the data, they'll feel confidence in it. And from there, I think that they will embrace the system.
I think that's great. And yeah, I know in the past, when I've been thinking about this from the vendor perspective, similar approach to you, Shawn, is like, what are the active contracts we have? And then prioritizing where the riskiest ones are, right? Those ones maybe on your product engineering side, a little more risky than event contracts that have happened and you're not going to be looking at again, hopefully. So really thinking about what you need to get in there to be successful, I think really helps drive on the post-signature side of the house, how you approach that and what success means. I think that's great. So one of the things with any technology solution that you implement, whether that's a CLM or other tech, is really thinking about not only where you're at right now, but where you're going to be in 18 months, where you're going to be in 3 years, and how do you implement in such a way that helps you scale. And Shawn, really thinking about it, how did you approach implementation or adjust post-implementation to ensure that you have the ability to scale as needed to support your growing business? And I know you talked about looking at it from a secondary implementation for procurement. So curious what decisions you made to help support that.
For us, it was more, that was really one of the keys to the vendor selection, because we were replacing a CLM from another vendor that was extremely difficult to evolve. So we had built out workflows for our master subscription agreements and for our data protection agreements, but adding additional agreement types and templates was very difficult. And so when we were looking at new vendors, we said, okay, it has to be a platform and a vendor that we can add new agreements, new templates, new workflows easily on ourselves without needing the vendor. Our admins should be able to do this on their own in a matter of minutes or hours. And so we picked LinkSquares. One of the reasons we did is that we got comfortable that we could launch new template types and new workflows by ourselves in-house in a matter of hours. That was critical to our confidence that we could evolve the system over time.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really great takeaway and insight. Jonathan, I'd be curious to hear from you. As organizations grow, contract complexity can evolve and change, not just the volume or types, but even just more specifically, the types of workflows within it. What advice do you have for folks who are implementing a CLM for how to approach thinking about where they might need to lean in to support that flexibility, not only from the initial implementation, but how that impacts future reporting and metrics?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're very focused at LinkSquares in our internal instances to make sure that we have the right data coming out of the system to actually inform us to make business decisions. It's something you need to keep in mind around maintenance and making sure that you have thought through how you're going to work with changes that evolve in the organization. Oftentimes, it's not something that you initially think about, and then it happens. And I think that first time where it happens, where there's a change that needs to be made, is a good time to start thinking about your process, because you might just be too busy with the initial onboarding to really think about all the change management that goes along the way. So I think when you start seeing those opportunities, don't look at them as a frustration point to be like, I missed everything. Make it a point to say, okay, this is the reminder that I need to start having processes in place for those changes.
All right, so preparation. We wanted to just spend a little bit of time. Jenn, can you share a little bit of advice on how you would recommend folks evaluate what to do to launch a CLM, what they can do in advance to prepare?
Definitely. I think that I've touched on a lot of this already, and it's really just keeping your eye on the big picture, right? Which is like, why are you buying this thing in the first place? You wouldn't be on this webinar, and you probably wouldn't be having these conversations across the board if CLM was not a pain point that you were, or a tool that you were looking to solve pain points for, right? Really being critical of what you're doing today and understanding how that actually translates over into a software. The way that you're operating today, I think also, and going into a process like this with an open mind is critical, knowing that what you're doing today is likely not the exact same way that you're going to be walking out of the implementation process. Outside of that, though, from an actual let's get ready to implement, I think understanding where your agreements are, where your contracts are living matters, right? I think that this is one of the things that slows folks down, where they don't have a strong grasp of where everything is. When it comes to getting the agreements over, I think that we touched on it before, what actually do you need in the system, and how do you make sure that the contracts that you're uploading are going to be the most critical? That way you're not spending time on things that maybe are ancillary to what the actual problem that you're looking to solve is. I think that one thing that happens a lot is that we tend to over-engineer a lot of our setups, right? I think that's human nature. So my advice here would be really to keep it simple, making sure that if one day Ashlyn isn't here, Jonathan still needs to be able to know what Ashlyn does in LinkSquares and is able to continue to keep the system moving in that way, right? And like having the Ashlyn specific workflows is not going to be conducive to scaling in the organization or to being successful across the rest of our company, right? When it comes to success, I think there's two things that we always run into, right? Which is, what does success actually look like? And how do we compare that to what is going on in my organization today? And then two, what does done look like, right? Because it takes us back to that big bang versus the phased approach. Our CRO talks a lot about this component of little moments of value, right? And really being able to take this idea of how do we make sure that the main thing is still at the heart of these conversations, that we are providing value to you and solving actual business problems that legal teams have, right? Even in the 4 years that I've been at LinkSquares, seeing those problems evolve because of the changing of technology has been something super cool to witness, and is going to be something that continues to change, evolve, and iterate, right? So if we have super complex workflows that we're setting up and organizational structures, they're not going to scale as the technology continues to progress as well.
Jonathan and Shawn, the question was, what kind of metrics are you tracking? Shawn, why don't you kick us off? If you could just share a couple metrics that you're tracking using the CLM, that would be great.
One of the best things that we did was, and Jen mentioned this, was to figure out what metrics we were going to want to measure in the new system once it launched, what were our key success metrics, and then measure them beforehand in the old system so that then we could show before and after, and then be able to show that we moved the needle significantly from before to after. We started out by viewing, first of all, throughput. So before we had to do, because we only had limited number of agreements in the system, we did some of our agreements in the system and the rest of them had to be done manually outside the system. So we were measuring basically percent in the system. So before it was like maybe 30% of agreements could actually be done in the CLM, and afterwards it was 100%. So it was a compliance metric or a throughput metric. We definitely measured completion time. What was from inception to close? What was the average completion time before and after? And we saved 38% reduction going from before to after. Another thing that we measure is we measure the efficiency of approvals and tasks. How many tasks are we having to create on each agreement to get input from other parties, and how quickly do those get resolved, and where are the bottlenecks? So we look at task volume and completion. And then finally, we look at risk variation. So on a few key areas like limitation of liability or data breach or things like that, how many agreements vary from our preferred positions? What percentage are compliant with our preferred positions, and what percentage has to get escalated, and we've agreed to some kind of escalated exception. So those are the key ones that we're tracking.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Shawn. And Jonathan, I know we track some of those as well internally, but are there any others that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
Yeah, I think also I would just say, as a starting point, if for anybody who hasn't had metrics or KPIs for their org, I think just starting on that path at the highest level, how many contract requests came into the legal organization, or how many contracts did the legal organization work on? Just something very basic is very interesting to start having that data point to be able to understand. So if it's 100 contracts are coming into the legal department, that's interesting. Look at it over time, and then it's going to start giving you insights. One of the things, in addition to what Shawn mentioned, what we track is we do like to track dollar value, particularly on sales contracts. A very big marketing piece for the legal team to say, hey, X amount of millions of dollars of sales contracts were signed, and the legal team worked on this percentage of them. It's extremely powerful insights into where contracts are in the negotiation process. That really helps our sales team. And it also helps us in legal to understand it's the last day of a quarter for a quarterly driven company. What percentage of the contracts that the sales team is saying is expected to sign have actually got to a place where they're likely to sign versus not.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. With that, let's just dive into the second category of Pitfalls, planning and strategy issues, not understanding your why is a big one. Why are you actually buying the CLM and implementing it? Failure to plan for enablement and adoption, not knowing where your data is or having bad data to start when you're putting it into the system and not identifying what metrics you want to report on. So we're going to spend a little time digging into these. So we will just dive into not understanding your why to start. Shawn, could you do a little bit of provide a little insight into how planning the implementation for a CLM impacts the overall success of the initiative?
I think it's critical from the beginning to make sure you've got the right team assembled and that you've included stakeholders from the right teams, the right people, so that there's number one, that there's buy-in from those teams and they're not like later, like we had nothing to do with this. We frankly at OutSystems realized this a little bit late in the process, that we really hadn't gone out to sales and previewed it with the sales team and gotten their feedback. Luckily, we realized it before we launched, held some focus groups and got input from the sales team. And then those people could say, oh, I've seen this exciting new thing that's coming, and tell some of the other sellers about it. We thought about that. It was like a diving save, as the saying goes. Highly encourage people to think about that much earlier in the process. Involve the right stakeholders on the right team, do focus groups, make sure those people really feel invested.
That's great. Thank you so much. Jonathan, when you've had to select an implementation of a CLM in the past or really think about implementing a CLM, was there a specific moment where you were like, shoot, we need a CLM and it's now? Or was this a gradual, slow understanding that this is a pain point that you had that could be supported through a CLM?
Yeah, I think it was gradual. I don't think there was a breaking moment, though I can imagine certain breaking moments occurring. And sometimes that's also when you're using a current technology that's managing your contracts or CLM and realizing that there's something better out there that can solve your pain points better. So I've noticed that tends to be pretty gradual. I think oftentimes what organizations will do is they'll hire somebody with the expectation that person will come in and set up this new tool and new processes. Jenn, I don't know, has that been your experience with working with our customers?
Yeah, absolutely. It has been. I think that making sure that you're identifying who your internal champions are going to be, right? One of the things that we see happen often is we'll have a project manager come on the customer side, and that person is responsible for the implementation of this, but they don't have the full understanding of why the tool was purchased and how to be effective in actually making the decisions that are critical to setting this tool up for success, right? And the decisions that we're making at the beginning of this process are going to be the ones that matter the most at the end of it, because they are the building blocks for everything that we are piling on top of the rest of the CLM. So really making sure, tying in what Jonathan's talking about and Shawn's talking about here, that you have the right group of folks part of these conversations, the people that are going to be in the application every week as part of this setup, and making sure that not only their voice heard and their opinion is part of the considerations that we're making, but also that they know what they're doing and that they know how to make this work. That way it is going to be successful.
That's great. Thanks, Jenn. Shawn, how did you ensure everyone on the project team across legal and other stakeholders really understood and were bought in on that?
In our case, the problem with the existing system had been going on long enough that people very much understood the limitations and the issues. And the key was to show them, sometimes you don't know what you're missing. So we had to show them what was possible above and beyond the limited capabilities that they knew, and then put some ROI around that. We could go get it sold, because all the money that went to the CLM didn't go to some other solution that some other department wanted. We had to justify it on the basis of how much it would benefit the company. So that's how we got everybody on board, was just through the fact that this was a process where we had been living with the pain points for a while. They were well understood across the company. And then we did an education campaign around the ROI benefits of adding additional functionality, and did it well enough, obviously, that we were able to get prioritized over other competing projects.
Not to hang out here too long, but since this is about implementations that have failed, we have seen a number of customers who have come in where there's like a new CFO who's just joined the organization and is taking stock of the way that things are happening inside of the company today. And they come to us and they're like, everything has to change. We need to get this a little bit more streamlined. I got to know where my agreements are. It's taking us way too long to get contracts out of the door. But we need something that's going to fix this for us. But they never consulted the legal team. By the time we get to implementation, we've invested all of this money for this expensive tool that requires a lot of work and a lot of thoughtfulness into preparing, and we don't have alignment with the project team, nor do we have alignment that the problems that we're looking to solve are in fact the ones that are most important. So really understanding that from the buying process perspective and understanding most importantly how that translates to the implementation of it all is super, super important. And consideration as part of the buying process is critical for success.
Awesome. How did you build your ROI case?
I've done this twice successfully. We really drove it off of renewals and the fact that if we could increase our renewal rate by a certain percentage and also increase the upsell rate at renewal, how much dollars that would be worth to the company. Because part of the problem was renewals would come up and we weren't prepared for them, or we didn't have a way of tracking them. And so we would go in with a really subpar strategy. The renewal rate wasn't as high as we knew it could have been. So we just made some conservative assumptions about how we could impact the renewal rate and then the upsell rate at renewal and put dollars on that. And it was like 3 times the cost of the CLM. That was the first time around that we did it. The second time at OutSystems, we did it based on the increase in velocity around sales transactions. So we were able to show that, posit that if we could a certain number of days out of each contract negotiation cycle, the increased speed to revenue for all those contracts and give it at our scale, if you could accelerate all of your sales, 15 days, for example, or 30 days, how much would that translate into in terms of increased revenue and faster revenue? And we put a number on that was credible, and that number was able to get us the budget.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. All right, so moving on to enablement. And enablement, we know, is key to successful implementation of any technology, but definitely CLM, which does, depending on how you deploy, impact so many organizations internally across your business. So Jenn, I'm curious, you've seen a lot of different enablement approaches over the years. Where does this usually go wrong?
Great question, Ashlyn. I think that there's a lot of things here to consider, right? But early and often, I think matters, right? If we're thinking about training, most software implementations are going to be followed by some sort of train the trainer methodology, right? Which is great. And I think it's something that we do, and it's something that as if I went to a different company, it would probably be the way that we consider a training motion as well. Thinking about it from an end user case, when you're implementing the solution itself, how is this impacting the user? Are they understanding what they need to be doing? And do they have the tools and the resources to be able to be successful in using the tool? Or is implementing a tool like a CLM going to be something causing more of a pain point in their everyday, right? If that's the case, then we're not going to ever get a point where this is going to be something that is actually going to be helpful for your team. So bringing them along the way and making sure that once we are moving through the phases of each one of these small phase approaches, that we're considering what the end user's functionality and usability looks like is something that really matters here. It's something that I would also encourage you to talk about with your implementation team, just to make sure that from a resources perspective, you have what you need, right? Documentation is the crux of a lot of organizations' problems, right? Making sure that it's up to date, making sure that it's consistent, making sure that it's actually correct in terms of what actually needs to be done, right? Identifying those champions early on within each part of your own organization is something that will really highlight success in getting something like this live.
For their team's questions and really champion the use of the tool and why it's so important can really help drive that adoption and help you identify where you may have pitfalls in enablement, right? And where you have opportunities to further enhance teams' understandings for increased adoption rates.
Definitely. And I think there's something to be said about using real life examples, right, as part of the implementation process to just make it that much more sticky. But leaning into the resources that your vendor is offering you really matters, right? But does like your procurement lead know how to actually contact the support team to get the answers that they need so that they're able to self-serve as well? And that's something that I really want to highlight as that something to be super successful once you actually exit the implementation phase is this something that I know how to support on my own because we paid attention during the implementation process?
Yeah, I love that. Usually technology providers have really great documentation, and I could have saved myself some time earlier in my career leaning on their knowledge articles rather than recreating my own. For those of you who are building out resources for your internal teams, make sure you're checking your vendors' solutions and seeing if they have anything that's ready-made for you to use. All right. So, Shawn, really wanted to turn this over to you. Organizations often, I think, underestimate the time that it's going to take to locate the contracts that they need to implement into a CLM and then ensure that their data is clean. And as you mentioned, that is so key to building trust at part of launch. So, what lessons have you learned regarding the importance of having clean data, and what do you wish you had known earlier?
We faced a significant challenge on this because we didn't have one central CLM where all the contracts had been processed. So we actually had to pull contracts from 5 different systems. And luckily the IT group, we leaned on them heavily. They had these automation scripts that could scrape these systems and look for contracts that had various features or documents. They were PDF, they had the words executed or signed or final, or they had various characteristics that gave you confidence that they might be a relevant document. But still, they scraped about 10,000 agreements from these 5 systems and then put them in a central repository, not the CLM, but like a Google Drive. And then our team just went through them and started to quickly identify like how we could tell which ones were obvious exclusions, which ones were obvious inclusions, and which ones needed to be worked or reviewed. And so we created a sub-repository of the ones that needed human eyes on them. And then we were able to bring in a contractor who was able just to do this heads down at a relatively low cost with some supervision from us and cull through that to determine keep, delete. And as a result of that process, we narrowed the 10,000 down to about 2,500 contracts that we brought into our repository with a high level of confidence that they weren't duplicates, they weren't unsigned, they weren't drafts, they weren't ancillary documents like a PO, that they were the actual signed legal agreements negotiated with our third parties.
So, just moving ahead here. So metrics, I know we've talked a little bit about how to measure the ROI, how to measure success, what metrics are being tracked. But I guess my question, and I'll pose this to Jonathan and Shawn, what is one piece of advice you have for how to communicate those metrics that you have to your stakeholders? Who are you communicating to, and what's the best avenue?
It's going to be dependent on organization, but what I think you want to be able to do is to find somebody in the organization who is actually going to appreciate your metrics when it's outside the legal use case you bought the CLM for. So, for instance, our chief legal officer will absolutely care how many contracts came through the system. Oftentimes, other business stakeholders do not. But what they do care about is, going back to what I said earlier about our revenue tracking, is they do care about how much revenue is coming through the legal team. So being able to find the metric that fits the stakeholders, the outcome they're looking for in terms of using legal as a service, and trying to facilitate communication to them to really highlight the value of legal. Obviously, at executive meetings and even board meetings, a lot of times our metrics will get shown.
On my side, Ashlyn, the one thing that it's evolved. At first, I just sent out a report every quarter to key leaders within sales, finance, sales ops, a couple other teams that listed kind of the key metrics, and it was mostly kind of bullet points. Then what I did over time is I started adding a graph. So every bullet point has to have a graph. Some of these come out of my LinkSquares dashboard. Some of them are like just an Excel graph or a Salesforce report. That way they can visually see the numbers. And then finally, what I added over time was, why is this metric important? So I've got just a one-liner that says basically like, why is this important to the business? And just sometimes it's not obvious how reducing 20 days out of the MSA cycle, like how does that affect the business? Or if we're able to get 10% more of our agreements to go to the click through on our website versus negotiating an agreement, what's the benefit of that? And so just making sure everyone understands, okay, here's what's happening in the metric and here's why it's really important to the business.
I think that's great advice. Data visualization is so important, but that why behind the metric, I think, is key for really having that understanding of what the impact is. So moving on to our final pitfall category, stakeholder and alignment issues. Jenn, can you walk through what recommendations you have for folks who are looking to identify who may be impacted at their company and how to approach identifying those stakeholders and users for your deployment?
Definitely. I think that one thing to just call out here is that just recognizing that we're working with legal teams of all different sizes, right? Sometimes it's one person and sometimes it's hundreds of people across the entire world. So understanding that per project and per the way that we're thinking about this from a rollout perspective, identifying the right people is really important for success, right? There's always going to be the person that's that decision maker. But from there, you need to make sure that along the way, that there's somebody who's actually managing the project. There's always going to be someone on the implementation side who's accountable to make sure that all the trains are moving on time, right? And the plates keep spinning. But the thing that matters on your side is that there is a joint level of accountability. So how do we make sure that we're hitting the timelines that you have on your own side, but also that we're doing things that we need to the right way to make sure that the system is being set up appropriately. Other roles to factor in are going to be a general administrator. We've talked a lot about this in this session here, just having somebody who's going to be knowing the ins and outs of the tool itself. But then lastly, I think really driving into that subject matter expertise and identifying someone as each phase of this rollout or each function that you're looking to set up on a CLM, making sure that there's one person on that team who's identified as a champion is really going to be that ongoing champion for your end users to make sure that things inside of your CLM are matching the needs of your organization.
What Jenn communicated here is really understanding the various stakeholder groups that you might have internally, but also most importantly, what roles might they need within the system? Usually different CLMs have different permissioning sets, making sure, do you understand, does all of finance need to be administrative users or maybe just one person or none, right? And so you can properly identify that. And the stakeholder input that you might need from each of those groups could vary depending on that. Shawn, Jonathan, anything you want to add on users and that?
So I'll just admit in the spirit of being transparent that we actually forgot a group. It was a small one, but we forgot them. And then a month or two after launch, they all of a sudden they kept hearing about this tool and they started being, what is this? I don't even know anything about it. And then they came to me and they're like, when did this happen? And then I just had this moment of sheer horror where I realized, oh shit, we never communicated or included them in the enablement. So it happens. It's really embarrassing. Luckily, it was a smaller group, but think about all these groups in advance, get them involved early. You don't want to be in the position I was in, which is feeling mortified and having to profusely apologize to that team for having left them out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's tough. It does happen though.
Yeah, nothing to add, just you don't want to owe anybody in an organization.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. I just wanted to pose a last question. Shawn, what advice would you have for folks for how to set proper expectations within a department when you're rolling this out?
I think that it's important just to be really thoughtful about your deployment timeline. Don't get more aggressive than you feel comfortable that you can achieve. That's why I liked the phased approach in particular. It allowed us to have a few early wins on timeframes that I frankly have more confidence in before we set the timeline for the big scary one at the end. So that would be mine, is just don't overpromise early on when it comes to the timing of your, unless you have a hard date you absolutely have to hit for some external reason, in which case then you just gotta go work as hard as you can to hit that date successfully.
Jenn or Jonathan, anything you want to add there?
Thinking actually about the last thing that Shawn just said, I think is really important. There is certainly the path here where, me as your implementation person can go ahead and set everything up for you, right? How do I keep this moving? And how do I make sure that every single time I don't need to do something, I have to contact my vendor, right? One of the things I think that you should probably have in your head as part of engaging into an implementation process is that there's going to be some level of work up front for you to make sure that this actually is set up the way that you and your organization need it to, right? So I think that would be something that I would advise having a conversation about in the sales process is like, what is the expectation of me here? Is this something that I can manage by myself? And what level of support are you all offering to me to make sure that it's something that I'm able to manage from a go forward basis?
Excellent. Jonathan, anything you want to add there?
I think that everybody covered it.
Awesome. All right, so this is our final slide recap, and I will just do rapid fire. One piece of advice you would give someone looking to embark on implementing a CLM. Shawn, we'll start with you.
My biggest piece of advice was just make sure you think about your data, where it's coming from, what data is the most critical. Is it all in the same format? How are you going to validate it? Start there.
I'd say understand your problem and then look at technology and see how it does. And don't just look at the technology, get your hands on the keyboards, try it out, and get a few stakeholders in the technology. We are still a little bit of a ways to go between the full maturity cycle of these contract management products. There's a lot of innovation happening in the space, and so a lot is changing. So definitely take a look. When you do, just have the right people next to you.
I guess I'll round it out here. The name of the game in implementation, no matter what you're implementing, is going to be hurry up and wait. So I think that what I would advise you all here is to really just to not be overly impatient, right? A lot of what we're looking to do is solve complex business problems, right? And what we're doing is we're taking a solution and trying to customize it and tweak it to be something that is getting you into a place that is not only different from what you're doing in your current system today, but is also hopefully going to be something that's going to make things better for you and your team, right? Knowing that it's also not going to be perfect every single time. Going into any implementation call, walking away saying there's always going to be a workaround is going to be something that's really important, and really just making sure that sometimes done is better than perfect. And for us to be able to keep moving on in this process will get us to a spot where we're going to be happy with the end result.
Awesome. Thanks so much. With that, I think we are ready to wrap it up here. We appreciate everyone's time today. We really enjoyed the conversation in the chat here. And Shai, I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Ashlyn, Jen, Jonathan, and Shawn, for a wonderful program. And thank you to the chat. A lot of great chatter in the chat, a lot of great advice and questions. So really appreciate it. I know we have a hard stop, so we will stop here. I hope everybody has a wonderful Monday. And if you have questions, get back in touch with our panel. This was phenomenal.